Taiwan has never been a part of the Communist People's Republic of China, and many of us here on Taiwan hope that we never will be. But Taiwan has been a part of China, Qing Dynasty China, and in today's episode we're going to be looking at the early years of the Qing rule on Taiwan, and also pointing out just how reluctant the Qing authorities were to take Taiwan. Basically, the Emperor Kangxi had to be persuaded by a famous admiral to keep Taiwan.
The Taiwan History Podcast, Formosa Files, is made possible through the generous sponsorship of the Frank C. Chen Foundation. Formosa Files.
Yes, it's understandable people react to the bullying of the PRC, but
Right.
Taiwan was part of China, technically just a province for a handful of years. It was a prefecture of Fujian province for over 200 years. And I like to think of Qing China as an empire.
Definitely.
It's more than double the size of Ming China and taking in territories around its periphery. And it's not ethnic Chinese, is it? The empire.
Right.
It's Qing rulers. They were Manchus, people from Manchuria in the northeast of modern-day China.
Yeah, quite impressive what the Qing managed to do. These were Manchu people, as you noted, from the northeast of modern-day China, and they spoke a completely different language. They spoke Manchu. And the men had that really strange Q-shaven forehead thing with a ponytail.
Not one of history's top 10 hairstyles, is it?
No. So Dutch rule on Taiwan ended with that dramatic siege of Fort Zeelandia, and we've done an episode on that. Ming loyalist and warlord pirate Zheng Keshuang, he died soon after his victory. And then his kingdom of Dongning, the thing that evolved afterwards and was ruled by his son and his grandson, it survived just 2 decades, and it was surrendered to the Qing in 1683. Qing rule then lasted until 1895, when it was ceded to Japan. And it's worth noting that when we're talking about Taiwan being under the dominion of China's Qing Dynasty, we're only talking about part of Taiwan. In particular, the western lowlands, certainly not the entire island.
Yes, we see a gradual expansion from the western plains, the western coast, into the foothills. But even at the end of the period, when the Qing ceded Taiwan to Japan in 1895, large areas of Taiwan's mountains were still outside of government control.
And considering that Taiwan is rather mountainous, what is it, like 2/3 mountains? So in actual terms...
half the island remained outside of effective Qing administration, and much more outside in the early years.
Okay, so let's start. Let's go to the year 1683. The Qing have defeated the heirs of Koxinga and come into possession of the short-lived kingdom of Dongning. The new Qing masters are faced with a choice. What to do with the island? Incorporate it into the Qing Empire or abandon it? It's kind of surprising that this was even a close decision, isn't it?
Yes, it surprises us because we're biased by the certainty of hindsight of knowing what happened.
Right, knowing that they decided to keep it.
Yes, so a running theme of our podcast is that history gives a false certainty to the sequence of events, a false uniformity of thinking surrounding these pivotal choices.
Yes.
Whereas there were usually numerous possibilities, a lot of debate, and a lot of happenstance. The question of keeping Taiwan or not keeping it was one such case. It was much debated and far from a foregone conclusion that the Qing would keep Taiwan.
Absolutely. Most of the imperial court, and especially the Emperor Kangxi, one of China's greatest and longest reigning emperors, they favored abandoning Taiwan. That is, after repatriating all of the Chinese. Kangxi's pretty famous for his negative opinion. He reportedly told his officials, "Taiwan is no bigger than a ball of mud. We gain nothing by possessing it, and it would be no loss if we didn't acquire it."
A ball of mud, eh?
Yeah.
He also compared acquiring Taiwan to a skin rash, in that although small, it would be an annoyance. Keep it and we'll have to scratch a lot.
Okay.
He thought that keeping the island so very far away from Peking would be an economic burden. needless expenditure for what was considered a wild land of disease, cannibals, disease, thick forests and high mountains. Did I mention disease?
You did. You mentioned disease several times. So obviously there was quite a bit of disease, and we're talking mostly malaria, yeah?
Mm-hmm.
So also, Kangxi, the great emperor of China, he had a continental mentality, it's fair to say. His eyes were on expansion into Central Asia.
And yet the emperor's instincts did not prevail. He was finally convinced to keep Taiwan, in large part by Admiral Shi Lang, the man responsible for defeating the Ming holdouts and securing their surrender.
Okay, so an admiral called Shi Lang won the day and helped to convince the Qing to keep Taiwan. And how did this Shi Lang and others, how did they win the debate?
He stressed strategic considerations for keeping the island.
What would those be?
Taiwan as a base for rebels and being a base for pirates who would attack vital shipping lanes and also make attacks on coastal areas of southern China.
And Shi Lang was in a good position to argue those points because he'd been on the ground and he was from the region. He had seafaring experience, expertise, and regional connections. So I guess he could make a pretty compelling case to convince the Qing court.
Yes. Shi Lang was from Fujian, across the strait from Taiwan. He'd served with the Zheng family fleet under Koxinga's dad, and then under Koxinga, who was 3 years his junior. He was brilliant and brave, but an arrogant commander, and he often argued with Koxinga.
They sound like they're actually quite similar in temperament. Two rather large egos.
Yeah. Shi Lang criticized Koxinga's orders, even ignored them at times. And following a military debacle at Xiamen in 1651, Koxinga imprisoned Shi Lang, but he was able to escape to Qinghao territory, and he went over to the other side, as Koxinga's father had a few years back.
Right.
Now, when Koxinga heard the news, he had Shi Lang's father, brother, and son put to death right away.
Wow. So Shi Lang escapes from prison. They used to be kind of at least buddies or fellow soldiers. He escapes from prison, and then Koxinga executes his father, brother, and son. Ow, that would certainly provide some motivation for fighting the Zheng regime. Were there any personal motivations in him wanting the Qing to hold on to Taiwan?
Well, in defeating the Zheng regime, yes, but he was motivated by personal gain. He was ambitious and was looking to enrich himself from possession of the island.
Okay. And before we started recording this episode, you said there was a little known side story about this Admiral Shi Lang?
Indeed. A side story, but one worth exploring, as it's a great counterfactual, a fun what if. And the Chinese indifference to Taiwan reveals a lot. And it's a story I learned from a chapter by historian Cheng Wei-Cheng in an academic book on the maritime history of East Asia. And the title of the chapter summarizes the story: Admiral Shi Lang's secret proposal to return Taiwan to the VOC.
Admiral Shi Lang's secret proposal to return Taiwan to the VOC. Wow. Yeah. And okay, if anybody doesn't remember, the VOC was the Dutch East India Company, headquartered in Batavia, that's present-day Jakarta. He wanted to return Taiwan to the VOC. What happened?
Okay, so it's early summer of 1683. Emperor Kangxi ordered Admiral Shi Lang to subdue the Zheng regime in the Pescadores, Penghu Islands, and Taiwan. Shi Lang's attack on the Pescadores devastated the Zheng forces. They lost nearly 200 junks, and a garrison of 1,400 men surrendered. So there'd be no need to attack Taiwan. On July 31st, Koxinga's grandson sent a letter of surrender to Shi Lang, who passed it on to Qi Sheng, the governor general of Fujian, who in turn sent it to Beijing.
So that was a relatively bloodless conquest. It could have been a lot worse. So the slow back and forth of communications in those days must have been the only reason that he could have gotten away with this kind of private scheme to give back Taiwan to the VOC.
Exactly. And Shi Lang certainly had some scheming in mind. So he wanted to establish himself as a regional sea lord, in effect replacing the Zheng regime. To make this happen, he had a devious, complicated plan, and a very dangerous plan too, as it involved lying to the emperor. His plans, his simultaneous scams, didn't play out as he hoped, yet he still set events in train that shaped the future history of Taiwan. So Shi Lang worked hard to convince the emperor about the need to keep Taiwan, as the emperor's initial instinct was, as we said, to abandon Taiwan after evacuating the Chinese living there, evacuate them to the mainland. At the same time, Shi Lang wanted the Dutch back in Fujian and Taiwan in order to boost trade in the area, of which he was going to take a healthy slice.
Okay. And as you told me earlier, that to remove competition from Chinese merchants in other ports, especially those in Guangzhou, he wanted maritime trade restrictions along the coast to be kept. And this would ensure his Taiwan operations would have greater profitability.
Yes, but going back to his plans for getting the Dutch back in Taiwan, when Shi Lang was in Taiwan, he oversaw the surrender and he enlisted the aid of Dutch prisoners remaining from 1662 and found one called Alexander van Gravenbrock to go and ask the VOC in Batavia to come back to Taiwan. But unbeknown to Shi Lang and all of this, Yao Qi-shang, the Governor General of Fujian, had actually made similar secret maneuvers earlier on.
Really?
Without permission from Emperor Kangxi, he had dispatched a mission of 90 people to the Dutch headquarters in Batavia in 1679. So he hoped to get the VOC to help in driving out Zheng from Taiwan. In return, they'd get trading rights and could reoccupy Taiwan.
We know from history that didn't happen, so obviously it was a failure.
Right, as Shi Lang would find out for himself, the Dutch weren't interested, being more focused on the Japan and India markets. And anyway, when it came to China trade, Guangdong was now a better option than Fujian or Taiwan. So Shi Lang, unable to entice the Dutch, ruled Taiwan by himself, though from Fujian, and he did so harshly, squeezing taxes and money from the island.
So if we're looking for a date for when it came into the fold, for when Taiwan came into the Chinese fold, it would be May 29th, 1684. That's nearly a year after the Zheng surrender. And Emperor Kangxi issued an imperial edict that read, Taiwan leaves the outside seas and comes under Chinese jurisdiction. So Taiwan, at least a good chunk of it, especially the southwest part, was now technically a part of China. But the Qing had not set out to acquire Taiwan permanently, and they, in effect, ended up as an accidental colonizer, basically due to the ambitions of men like Shi Lang. The rulers in distant Peking would continue for quite a while to feel ambivalent about Taiwan. But having decided to keep Taiwan, the contention now shifted to whether or not it was fit for colonization.
Yes, unlike the Zhengs and the Dutch before them, the Qing did not seek to develop the island. They followed a policy of quarantine, restricting Chinese immigration to Taiwan, and did not seek to extend control over the entire island. And instead, they sought to restrict Chinese infiltration into Aboriginal areas in the hope of avoiding frontier disputes.
And the Qing rulers did not initially allow women to cross the strait. Their hope was to keep the men tied to the mainland. They were thinking that most of the men would return home to their families after the fall harvest and then go back for spring planting. So no women. Ouch. You also needed permission from port authorities if you wanted to travel or sail to Taiwan, and you had to get all these papers, red chops, all this sort of stuff. And every time you have to get a paper and a chop and a stamp or whatever, it's invariably an opportunity for official graft. And of course, as ever, it's cheaper and easier to do things outside the law. So if you've got money for bribes, you could get your way through. The emperor is way up in Beijing. Enforcement is difficult, right?
In 1722, the Chinese authorities established a north-south boundary line, the length of Taiwan. This was stretching along the western foothills. This demarcation line, mostly existing as ink on maps, was marked on the ground by 54 stone markers in strategic locations. The idea was the Chinese settlers were prohibited from moving into the mountain areas. But of course, encroachment did occur, and the line was redrawn higher up a few times during the century. And eventually they dug ditches, and some guards were posted along this line.
Interesting. So the Qing were really not, at least initially, interested at all in bringing the local native people, the Aborigines, into the fold in any way.
Yeah, they wanted just to keep things as quiet as possible.
And we are quite lucky to have a detailed eyewitness account from this early Qing period. And it's a travel account. It's a book called Yu Yonghe's Small Sea Travel Diaries. So what do we know of this Yu Yonghe?
Well, he was an adventurous literati, maybe an official. We lack biographical information about him. He happened to be traveling in Fujian when the need arose for a brave volunteer for a mission. He was perhaps 50 years old, from Zhejiang province, that's to the north of Fujian. He was a man of means, educated, and he had a traveler's spirit. He was attracted rather than repulsed by the stories he heard about Taiwan.
An adventurer. So you said he was on a mission, and what we know the mission is related to what happened in the winter of 1696. The Imperial Chinese gunpowder stores exploded that winter, 1696, and you need sulfur to make gunpowder. Taiwan has a lot of sulfur. So now that it's come into Qing hands, you stepped forward to go there and oversee the mining of that sulfur.
It turned out to be a grueling 10-month mission. In the early spring of 1697, he sailed to the city of Taiwan Fu.
Or modern-day Tainan.
That's right. Taiwan Fu, Tainan.
So how long did that sail take?
Well, getting across the strait was always a bit of a lottery time-wise. It could take anywhere from a couple of days to...
Like never?
Indeed, yeah. For some, it was a one-way trip, yeah. Yu Yonghe needed 10 days to get across. So he boarded a ship in Xiamen, March 8th. He's got a 3-day wait, and he gets to a small island just outside of Xiamen. Then he's waiting 2 days more. And then when the winds are right, he sets off with 12 other ships, which have been waiting. So he arrives in Taiwan. It's about 5 days later. But it's interesting. 6 of those 12 ships arrive with him, but the others take another 5 to 7 days. And the last one took 10 days more than his ship did.
Yeah, so you really could not count on a specific time frame for getting across the strait.
No.
So Yu Yonghe is in Taiwan Fu, as we noted, that's modern day Tainan. And he's there because he needs to get men and supplies for a trip to the north. His supplies include cotton cloth, and he's going to trade this cloth as well as oil and sugar. He's got this big wok, wooden barrels and scales. For food, he's got millet and pickled black beans. He's got so much stuff. He buys a junk to carry it, but it's not big enough, so he has to buy a second, smaller one.
After 2 months in the capital, he sets out in an ox cart, accompanied by 55 troops, servants, aborigines, and workers up the western plains.
And if he had listened to the officials in Tainan, he probably wouldn't have gone anywhere. The officials there told him to stay and just send his workers. These officials were likely concerned for his safety, but also they didn't want to look like cowards by comparison because they weren't going anywhere. They stayed in their safe little redoubt there in Tainan. At the time, Taiwan was divided into just 3 districts. Taiwan Fu, that's Tainan. Then to the south, you had Fengshan. That included where I live in Kaohsiung and the Pingdong area. And to the north, Zhulo. And Yu Yonghe writes, Zhulo and Fengshan have no residents, only savages. So it's worth noting that the district magistrates for Zhulo and Fengshan in the first couple of decades, which is the time that Yu Yonghe visited, they ran all their affairs out of Tainan. They didn't reside in their districts.
Yu Yonghe wasn't put off. He told them if the journey is not dangerous, then it's not exciting. If there's no difficulty, he would not enjoy it. His concession to safety, though, is to go overland rather than by sea. And his journey is very interesting. The Aborigines he meets are impressive in their appearance. He describes their tattoos, nakedness, their ornaments. The men are covered in tattoos of bird wings, leopards, tigers, fishnets.
Okay.
And they've got huge earlobes. They would make holes in the ears and then progressively stretch them out by putting bamboo pieces in them.
So hipsters.
Yeah.
So then when he's passing through coastal settlements in what would be modern day Miaoli County, pretty much close to Ho Long Village, he sees a companion from that first junk ship, the bigger one. And the companion is in tattered clothes and limping. And he's got this sad story of the ship being wrecked on the shore. So we know that one of the ships was wrecked. And the second ship?
Well, they don't know yet. But a few days later, when they arrive in Danshui, they see that ship, though it's lost some of its supplies in a storm too. He's down to about 20% of his original supplies. So it's been a 3-week trip by the time he gets to Beitou, where he set up camp and began bartering goods for sulfur, which was brought in by the Aborigines.
Okay.
So Beitou is in, how would you describe it?
Beitou is in Taipei City to the north of the city. It's a mountainous area and it's got a lot of hot springs, natural hot springs. It's been a place for hot springs since, I don't know, forever. I guess there's some like dormant volcanoes. You can get there on the Taipei MRT these days. It's not that big of a journey, maybe 30 minutes from, right downtown. So I'm interested in this part of the sulfur being brought in by the Aborigines. So he's bartering goods for sulfur and the Aborigines are doing the work, bringing in the sulfur. Did the native people know the value of sulfur or did the Chinese have to teach them? How did that work?
They'd already been mining and selling large quantities of sulfur. This was the gunpowder age. And as you said, sulfur is a valuable component. The deposits in Beitou, they were a draw for the Spanish to settle in the north and why the Dutch were so keen to take it away from them. And the Aborigines were selling large amounts to Chinese pirates or pirate traders. And we're talking hundreds of tons a year. So Yu and his workers did the job of refining the sulfur, and they used large woks, cooking the sulfur with oil and earth to separate it.
Okay, so sulfur, wow, it's one of those forgotten raw materials that we just, don't use anymore, like whale oil or silver as a world currency or salt being so valuable, deer skins or camphor oil from that camphor tree.
Yes, so you traded cloth for the sulfur. He said he was happy to do so. He was appalled by the Aboriginal women's state of undress.
Okay.
Or maybe not. He thought some of the younger women were pretty, though they had the unfortunate habit of putting deer oil in their hair, which he said smelt just horrendous and one couldn't get near them.
Interesting. If I had to bet, now there's no evidence for this, but if I had to bet, maybe that deer oil kept mosquitoes away or something. They must have had a purpose for doing that.
Yeah, I don't know. We have to do some experiments. Yeah.
Okay.
Yu's travel log is fantastic. It's full of details of arduous travel in Taiwan and the impenetrable jungle and the insects, the mosquitoes and flies like hungry eagles and tigers, he says. Yeah.
Oh, and don't forget the snakes. He hated snakes. You phrased it quite well in your book, Taiwan in 100 Books. You said he had an Indiana Jones aversion to snakes, as I recall.
That's it.
He mentions snakes crying in the night, sometimes snoring like oxen. Snakes snoring like oxen. He said small ones would chase people and they were fast as flying arrows. And then he also writes one story about this giant snake devouring another snake. And when somebody asked him about this loud screaming they heard in the night, it was like, oh, it's snakes. Everything was snakes.
Yeah, but of course, the greatest danger was illness.
Right, by far. And the area of Beitou, which is now, as we just noted, a lovely Taipei suburb, and it's associated with health these days because of hot springs, back then seemed to have been especially treacherous. Of northern Taiwan, Yu writes in his travel diaries, quote, those who come die, and no one knows if it is from ghosts or from poison.
His servant got sick, and then 90% of his party came down with illness, malaria, I suppose. The cook had dysentery. The settlers had a saying that for every 10 men who went to Taiwan, 6 would die, 3 would stay, and 1 return. Yu sent his men, some of them back to Fujian, many of whom he finds out later died. And he's the only one who didn't get sick. But he has a new group of workers arrive, and before long, they're sick as well.
Wow. So 6 out of 10, 6 die, 3 stay, and 1 return. That's not real great math. And from his book, Yu Yonghe also seemed to believe that the native inhabitants were formidable people. He did use the thinking and the terminology that was current at that time. He divided them into 2 categories. He called the plain savages cooked savages, and the wild savages were termed raw savages. But despite all that, he did express a rather admirable concern for the local people, for the Aborigines. He was critical of earlier mistreatment against them by the Dutch and the Zheng regimes, and also of current mistreatment by Chinese settlers. And he blamed the cause of these frontier disputes on the Chinese rather than on the Aborigines. And he was even hopeful about civilizing them. He estimated in his book that it would take between 30 to 100 years to do this. And he writes, then what will be the difference between them and the Chinese?
He sailed home in November. Was a 3-day wait for the winds, and then a dramatic 3-day crossing with his ship's mast broken and at mercy of the winds and currents. He was delighted to be home and keen to write up his adventures.
I would think so. Okay, John, any last thoughts on Yu Yonghe?
Well, you know that dinner guest game, the question, if you could invite anyone from history, who would you invite? Although for me, it would be a drinking session, of course. But I would like one of them to be Yu Yonghe.
Okay. And what in particular would you talk about or ask him? I assume you'd ask him why he's so afraid of snakes.
Okay, that's a good one. I'd ask him what he thought of Shi Lang. There's no mention of Shi Lang in his account. Damning silence. Shi Lang was likely very unpopular on the ground when Yu Yonghe was there, and he would have encountered quite a few Chinese settlers who had once owned land and had it seized and then rented back to them. They wouldn't be happy.
Yeah. But at least this Admiral Shi Lang, he didn't massacre the descendants of Zheng, right? Zheng Keshuang. Koxinga's grandson and others, considered royalty and various other officials, they were given amnesty. They were given titles even and sent back to Beijing.
Yes, and the rank and file soldiers, they got relocated. They got moved to remote areas of northern China to break in farmland. And the more able soldiers, they were absorbed into the military. And we hear of a unit, 500 strong. And they were sent up to the Chinese-Russian border, the freezing borderlands of Manchuria. The Russians at that time were expanding into Siberia.
So from subtropical Taiwan and Fujian to the subarctic winters of northern Manchuria, that's not a posting that I would want. And I guess for many, it was a one-way trip. Yeah. The fickle currents of empire. I just want to recommend a couple of books. We couldn't have done this episode without 2 books by McCabe Callagher. Small Sea Travel Diaries. That's a translation of Yu Yonghe's account. And then there's Out of China, The Journey and Background on 17th Century Taiwan. So that's going to do it for today. I'm Eric Michael Smith, and you've been listening to Formosa Files.
I'm John Ross.
Catch you next time.